here are 6 science fiction authors that at least sometimes are quite postmodernist. Let's start with the easy ones that probably no one would deny and we'd all be the first ones for us to think us. Kurt Vonnegut. Now, Kurt Vonnegut has a lot of range, and not everything he writes really qualifies as science fiction, I would say. But a whole lot of it does. If you've read The Sirens of Titan or Cat's Cradle or Slapstick, these are unambiguously science fiction novels. You can't get away from that fact. Not everything he writes is postmodernist, but plenty of it is. And again, if you look at something like Breakfast of Champions, which is so highly metafictional and does other interesting things with his use of So It Goes and his pictures, and there's a lot going on in Cat's Cradle that is innovative. Not Cat's Cradle, Breakfast of Champion, that is innovative and experimental, and absolutely he's a postmodernist. Kurt Vonnegut, postmodernist, also a science fiction writer, also very good. The next one on the list, again, probably not that surprising, Philip K. Dick. So Philip K. Dick is all about identity. Like, pick up almost any random thing that he wrote, and he's dealing with this concept of identity. He has doppelgangers and clones and mirrors and hallucinations and holograms all over the place. There's the unreliable narrator is the norm, right? Questions about what's real and what's not real in the two worlds, and which is the world of the mind and which is the world of the physical, are just chock full of his writing every darn place. Also, so here, if you haven't read a lot of Philip K. Dick, we've probably all seen the movie Blade Runner. Blade Runner was based on Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep, which is a short story by Philip K. Dick about these replicants, these human-looking manufactured beings that are not human, and gets into the question of, well, are we how do you know? How do I know? And then replicants don't know they're replicants. And then that comes to the question, well, how do we know we're not replicants, right? So all that's built right into there. That comes directly from Philip K. Dick. Another one is Minority Report. And Minority Report, again, he's got this questions about what is real and what is not. This report, the future seeing people come out with this thing saying the guy's going to commit a crime he hasn't committed yet, but he hasn't committed it, right? And can he not commit it? And so all of these ideas are just very postmodern. They're built right into Philip K. Dick. This one in particular probably does deserve to be called out. That Man in the High Castle popularized and introduced to most of the world, introduced the concept of the alternate history. So The Man in the High Castle is set in an America that lost World War II to the Germans, and we're occupied by Germany. And it's not the main story of the book. There's another story. There's this guy in occupied Germany, and he's doing his things that he's doing, but he's doing them in occupied Germany, or in occupied America, German occupied, Nazi occupied America. And that was such a mind blower. Not the very first book that's done this, because Vladimir Nabokov did something very similar ahead of this, but this really popularized the idea, brought it to the science fiction world in mass, and now it is a whole subgenre that's just focused on that. Okay, author number 3, Gene Wolfe. So Gene Wolfe has a huge amount of range. He writes horror, he writes science fiction, he writes a little bit of fantasy, he writes kind of some fabular stuff, he writes some uncanny things that are sort of hard to describe, but it's always in the world of the unreal, of the fantastical in some sense or another. And sometimes he will have things that are straight up metafictional. He definitely has the postmodern penchant for including documents and frames and things along those lines. This one in particular, The Fifth Head of Cerberus, is an absolute masterwork. It's broken into 3 different novellas, if you will. The first novella is told from the viewpoint of this boy who grows up into a young man, and as he does so, he realizes that his whole household is versions of himself. He's a clone of his father. his brother is his clone's offspring. His so-called brother is also kind of his son. There's a robot walking around with a simulation, and it's with a simulated personality, and it is a simulated personality of a usual earlier version of him. There is a woman in the house, and she's the sister of his cloned father, quote unquote. And so there's this whole kind of complicated family, and there's all kinds of clones that are out there in the world that he runs into, and they're slaves and servants. It's like every time a clone doesn't go very well, his father, quote unquote, just sells it as a slave. And so there's all of this kind of just this giant mess of identity that is just completely inside of the title novella of the three in this book, The Fifth Head of Cerberus. Now there's three. Cerberus has three heads. It's right there on the cover. And then we move on to the next one. And the next one is a story. It's called A Story by John V. Marsh. That's the name of it. And John V. Marsh is a character from the first one. And in that story, quote unquote, there's huge questions about identity. This is where the human settlers on this planet, there are these natives who can shapeshift, and they can shapeshift their bodies, but also their minds. And so there's a huge amount of ambiguity and confusion, even among the people in the story, about which ones are human settlers and which ones were original creatures. And it's not really settled to anybody's satisfaction. They get confused themselves in the course of the book, very focused on identity and stuff. And then the third one picks up that story by John V. Marsh, and the third one is someone is reviewing documentation for what is essentially a criminal case. And the whole story is just a little bit of frame with this guy looking at the documentation and kind of laying out a little bit there's a criminal case, but most of it is documents themselves. So we're looking at transcripts and journal entries and news articles and letters and things along those lines. So again, this postmodern interest in form, see my video on form, this postmodern interest in pulling documents in and including documents inside of other documents, postmodern interest in frames, all of those built in there. All three of them, absolutely, you could read them as standalone novellas. You think, oh, this is a standalone novella. Okay, I got it. And they're all very good. You'd like them all very much. But by putting them together under the same cover with the three heads, the three things, we get this richer, more complex fictional narrative world to deal with. This is the kind of thing that Gene Wolfe does very well. Another thing about Gene Wolfe is he's an early, I'd say a strong champion, ahead of David Foster Wallace, of what they call the open novel. So sometimes Gene Wolfe stories come to a pointed resolution, or novels. Sometimes they don't. Sometimes they're kind of acknowledging that the world is open and it's always ongoing and there's a whole million threads coming through and we're just going to look at some of them, but nothing ever is resolved. And this is a very Gene Wolfe thing to do, where things are never really resolved and never really done. Again, a very postmodern outlook. Next on the list, Stanislaw Lem. Stanislaw Lem is a science fiction writer through and through. Never, everything he writes is science fiction. Unambiguously, that is what he does. It is science fiction. Some of it is rather traditional, like Solaris. Although even Solaris has questions about identity and stuff like that in them. Some of it, though, is extremely postmodern. And the best example of that is the Siberiad. Well, maybe the best example is his Real Reviews of Imaginary Books, which I covered in my Real Imaginary Books episode earlier. So I'm not going to focus on that one. I'm going to focus on this one, the Siberiad. And the Siberiad is this story of these two android, robot, cyber people, whatever you call them. And it's a series of disconnected stories that are connected to each other, or that each tell the story of these two rival inventors. They're inventors, and what they're doing to try to one-up each other the whole time. And this basic premise that Lem has gives him the opportunity to be extremely postmodern in how he does it. And he has frames and nested boxes and mirrors and reflections and questions about identity and what's true and what's not, and linguistic games and all these very postmodern things all going on in this book, The Siberian. Packed, jam-packed, wonderful, amazing, excellent book. Everything Stanislaw Lem writes, I really like. Some of it is quite traditional. You're just reading a science fiction book about people in rockets going to planets, right? Some of them, though, are very pomo, like this one. Next, I've got Harlan Ellison. Harlan Ellison is kind of similar to Stanislaw Lem in that Harlan Ellison, early in his career, he's writing kind of realism, sort of this adventure realism stuff, but he finds his groove in science fiction / horror / the uncanny. And like a lot of writers, especially of this period, fantasy, science fiction, and horror are all kind of sort of the same lump group, and they just kind of float around within them. And this is what Harlan Ellison does. And he gives us lots of things. There's tends to be a hint of the horror in there just because he's Harlan Ellison. Doesn't do much that I would call high fantasy, but he does plenty that is just real science fiction. So he's very much a science fiction author. And the thing about Harlan Ellison is he's got this incredible exuberance. He wants to do everything to the max. He wants to have the maximum emotion and the maximum impact and the maximum wow. There's not a thread of minimalist in the guy. He does everything big, big, big. And part of doing everything big is experimentalism and form. So he'll try everything once. So again, you can look at Harlan Ellison and you can find a little bit of metafiction and some concrete prose and working with frames and lots of things along those lines. Incorporation of visual images in his fiction, and it's just this extreme penchant for experimentalism and exploration that fundamentally lays him down a road that sometimes looks very postmodern. He also edited a series of books, the Dangerous Visions books. And the first one in particular, Dangerous Visions, was garnered a lot of attention, a lot of critical and public attention, sold a lot of copies, did very well, and incorporated some quite postmodern science fiction or fantasy or horror stories alongside things that were much more traditional. And so he gave those authors in those stories a megaphone to talk to people, a soapbox to be on. And that too, so Harlan Ellison, not just for his own writing as postmodern, but also bringing other postmodern works to the fore, deserves to be called attention to. And then the last one I'm going to call your attention to today is J.G. Ballard. And I've pulled out the Atrocity Exhibition. The Atrocity Exhibition is an absolutely amazing book. It's got this, it's a bunch of short stories, but they really feel like they go together to the point where instead of just calling them stories, he actually calls them chapters. Chapter 1, Chapter 2, Chapter 3. Even though each of them is separate and independent of the others. And these chapters are very thematically related to each other, but also they take this very sort of documentarian, a dark, absurd, nihilistic documentarian approach. And you'll see this in some of the titles, so I'm just going to read some of these titles to you. Plan for the Assassination of Jacqueline Kennedy. The assassination of John Fitzgerald Kennedy considered as a downhill motor race. Why I want to fuck Ronald Reagan. So these were various stories, and like if you think about the assassination of John F. Kennedy as a downhill motor race, that's exactly what it is. He explains this. Princess Margaret's facelift, that's another one. And it's got this kind of dark, plan for the assassination of Jacqueline Kennedy describes, like, in a very, I want to say, analytic way, cold analytic way, how Jacqueline Kennedy elicits certain responses from people as if there's science behind this. And the science, here we go. Let's just look at one of these and it'll really make sense, right? So, notes toward a mental breakdown. And he's got these sections, the impact zone. And he describes that. And then the next section says the polite Wasserman, and it describes that. And the next section says the University of Death. And so it's got this very cold, analytical, pseudoscientific, dark, unreal, sort of the darkest of Cold War, nihilistic, hopeless postmodernism, which is sort of a subgenre of postmodernism. All brilliant, extremely affecting, extremely emotionally affecting in conveying this basic idea that our technocratic, evolving, industrialized, urbanized society, media-saturated society, is sort of putting us in this world of a cold, robotic, disconnected kind of place. Very brilliantly written. J.G. Ballard also has range, but he tends to go in that direction quite a bit, and it all comes off feeling extremely postmodern. Now, there are, I think, many more science fiction authors who are postmodern, and I do intend to follow up on this with probably more editions of this as more things come to mind and I pull them forward. These are just the ones that I was thinking of today. I also think that there is a kinship, a friendship between postmodernism and science fiction that is beyond that and other popular genres. And in a future episode, I would like to explore that. And then additionally, in a future episode, I would like to turn around and talk about postmodern authors who are definitely postmodernists who sometimes give us science fiction. So we'll get in all of that. Science fiction and postmodernism have this, I think, if love affair is too strong a word, but they definitely get together and make out once in a while. And, it's fascinating and it's interesting to see how it all comes together. All these authors are very good. All of these authors are definitely, decidedly, unambiguously science fiction authors, and they all have at least times when they're extremely postmodern. Thank you.